we are recording this and we'll share. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, unless any of you are coming from Newfoundland, and then good afternoon or points east. I'm Joel Berg. I'm the CEO of Hunger Free America. I am so delighted to have this panel today to discuss this very, very important book by Dr. Priya Fielding-Singh, How the Other Half Eats: The Untold Story of Food and Inequality in America. And then some of the respondents that I will be moderating include the Honorable Dan Glickman. He was, for 18 years, a congressman from Wichita, Kansas. He was a distinguished Secretary of Agriculture, where he was, among other things, my boss. He was the former head of the Motion Picture Association of America. We have the amazing Ertharin Cousins, who's a visiting scholar at the Stanford Center on Food and Security and the Environment, Food Security and the Environment, and she's the former executive director of the United Nations World Food Program. And last but not least, Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, who's the dean of the Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy and professor of medicine at the Tufts School of Medicine. I will give an uncharacteristically brief introduction to Dr. Fielding-Singh and let her speak for herself. But there's so much debate in America of why Americans don't eat healthier diets and why low-income Americans are at least marginally more likely to eat unhealthy diets than Americans overall. And there are a lot of myths about that. But I think her book absolutely brilliantly, with a mind-numbing detail and compassion, and both academic vigor and a very well-told story, really dispels some of those myths. So far better than me explain it, I will introduce Dr. Fielding-Singh, who can give a brief overview of her book. Thank you for joining us this morning, Doctor, and thank you all our distinguished panelists.
Thank you so much, Joel, for that really kind introduction. And thank you to you and Hunger Free America for hosting this event. I'm really excited and honored to have the opportunity to share a bit about my book and my research with you all this morning, and to get to discuss them with such an incredibly distinguished panel of experts in the fields of food and nutrition. So today I'm going to be talking about a stream of research that features in my book. And in this stream, I draw on years of fieldwork that I conducted on families' diets to share with you how the symbolic meanings that food holds to mothers across the income spectrum both help shape what goes onto their children's plates and are also really central to understanding food and nutrition inequities in America. So I'm going to start by sharing a story with you about a mother who I interviewed as a part of this research. So Faye Bautista was a low-income single mom who had emigrated from the Philippines to the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 1990s. And at the time that I met her, Faye was going through a really rough patch. 2 months earlier, she'd been laid off from her job as a janitor. And a few weeks after that, unable to keep up with the rent, Faye had been evicted from the apartment that she and her 16-year-old daughter, Melanie, called home. Now, fortunately, a friend knew of a shared apartment with a few spare rooms, so Faye rented 2 of those out, giving one to Melanie and sharing the other with her boyfriend. In the evening that I met Faye, she and I sat kitty corner at the kitchen table in her apartment. Faye was collecting unemployment benefits, which helped pay the rent, utilities, and her and her daughter's cell phones. And the rest of the money, Faye told me very matter-of-factly, went to buying Melanie takeout for lunch and dinner. These 2 meals, Faye estimated, cost her around $35 a day. About 25 minutes into our conversation, I watched Melanie walk from her room where she was doing her homework into the kitchen, her arm outstretched and her palm up. And I watched Faye place the dollar bills in her daughter's hand. "We spend a lot of money for food," Faye told me. "Whatever Melanie wants." In that moment with Faye, I found myself thinking of so many lower income mothers I'd interviewed whose spending in some ways echoed Faye's, and I grappled with 2 questions. First, why would someone like Faye put almost all of her disposable income toward expensive takeout when she could spend just a fraction as much on a much cheaper meal? And second, how can Faye's choices help us understand how other families in America those with more and those with fewer resources eat. By the end of this talk, my objective is to provide you with some answers to both of those questions. But first, perhaps a question you're asking yourself now is, why was I sitting down with Faye in the first place? So when I was a PhD student interested in researching health disparities, I was repeatedly struck by one disparity relating to something I did, something every single one of us does multiple times a day. I'm talking about diet disparities. I was really struck by the disparities in the nutritional quality of what families eat in this country, disparities that affect both adults and children alike, disparities that have existed for decades, and disparities that routinely privilege higher income, highly educated white Americans. For instance, compared to adults with higher incomes, lower income individuals consume fewer fruits and vegetables, more sugar-sweetened beverages. They have lower overall diet quality and are significantly more likely to be food insecure. And these disparities matter because of just how much our diets matter for our health and overall well-being. Disparities in our nutritional intake help drive broader health disparities across society, and a low-quality diet is consistently linked to multiple chronic diseases. In fact, in the US, a low-quality diet is the leading cause of mortality, causing 500,000 deaths per year. This is all to say, on the most basic level, and without trying to sound too dramatic, that what we eat is literally a matter of life and death. And the seriousness of this matter means that there's an urgency in answering the question of what drives nutritional inequality. That is, what accounts for the dietary gap between the most and the least privileged in American society. Now, about a decade ago, a number of academics, policymakers, and food advocates alike began to coalesce around a central answer to this question. And they proposed that differences in access to healthy food drove differences in diet. And they tended to focus on two kinds of access. So the first was geographic access, what many of us associate with the term food desert, that describes the spatial disparities in families' access to healthy food, with lower income and families of color more likely to live in neighborhoods without supermarkets or fresh fruits and vegetables. The second type of access was financial, with the basic argument here being that over the past 30 years, on a calorie basis, healthy food has become more expensive than unhealthy food, thereby incentivizing those with limited funds to make less healthy dietary choices. Now, the popularity of the food access arguments was in many ways spurred by the Let's Move campaign to reduce childhood obesity that began in 2010, and that popularized the idea that childhood obesity stemmed in part from inadequate geographic food access. The argument had really wide appeal because it offered a straightforward, actionable solution. If access was the problem, then the fix was clear. By opening supermarkets in low-income communities, families' nutrition would improve and obesity rates would fall. And so over the next decade, eliminating food deserts became a really central element of the campaign, and policy efforts followed to increase low-income communities' access to healthy food. But if the goal of those efforts was to improve families' diet quality and reduce obesity, then these initiatives' impacts turned out to be surprisingly disappointing, as researchers showed that increasing food access did very little, if anything, to change families' diets. In fact, a 2019 econometric analysis suggested that food access accounts for just 10% of the nutritional gap in the United States, which means that 90% of dietary differences are not due to differences in food access. Now, the authors of this study argue that the other 90% is due to differences in consumer demand, and a robust body of scholarship in food and nutrition points us toward many key factors that may yield such demand-side differences, from disparities in health and nutrition literacy to inequalities in education and time available to buy and cook healthy food, to really significant inequalities in exposure to marketing from the food and beverage industry. However, as a sociologist, I've always been struck by an assumption underlying many of these explanations, an assumption that, to my mind, might limit their explanatory power. And that assumption is that food's meaning to people is solely material. That is, that people eat just to nourish themselves and to physically survive. And under this assumption, it should be relatively easy to change families' dietary behaviors, or at least straightforward. Replace a fast food establishment with a full service supermarket, and people will individually change how they eat to reflect that broader structural change. Now, certainly on the most basic level, physical survival is what food is about, but we all know that food is about so much more than that. Food doesn't just have material meaning to us. Food also carries tremendous symbolic meaning to us. And by that, what I mean is that what we eat serves really critical social, cultural, and emotional roles in our lives. We eat to connect with others. We eat to show love and affection. We eat to remember who we are and where we came from and what we believe in. And so because we know that food carries tremendous symbolic meaning to us, more deeply understanding what drives nutritional inequality between American families requires answering two related research questions. First, what does food symbolically mean to families across society? And second, how do these symbolic meanings help shape how families eat? So to answer these two questions, I conducted a qualitative study on families' dietary practices and beliefs. For this, I collected two novel data sets. The first consisted of in-depth interviews among 75 families sampled across socioeconomic status that also varied in race, ethnicity, marital, and employment statuses. And within each family, I interviewed at least one parent and one adolescent for a total of 160 interviews. In addition, I gathered ethnographic data with 4 families that I selected from my interview sample. For months, I lived alongside these families, embedded in their everyday experiences. I observed families as they went about all kinds of activities, from back to school nights to Sunday morning church services. I attended birthday parties, chopped fruit at kitchen counters. I sat in the drive-through and I stood outside food banks with them. And my goal through this kind of deep on-the-ground observation was to understand the role that food played in their lives and the meanings that food took on given their vastly different environmental contexts. As a site for my research, I chose a place known for the inequality, the San Francisco Bay Area, a place where the top 1% of income earners make 44 times more than everyone else, a place where, for me, in doing this research, I interviewed extended families living in their RVs just a stone's throw from those living in multi-million-dollar mansions. It's a place where I recruited families standing in food bank lines just blocks from where others were dining in Michelin star restaurants. And while the Bay Area's juxtaposition of affluence and poverty can feel really extreme, it's also increasingly characteristic of American life. In an age of rising inequality, the region has been a trendsetter rather than an outlier. And so while the families in my study lived in the Bay Area, the story I'm going to tell you today, I'm going to suggest is a largely American one. Today's is also a story of socioeconomic inequality, and it's one that centers on mothers who in modern American society remain children's primary caregivers, as well as the parent largely responsible for grocery shopping, meal prepping, and cooking. I tell many other stories from these data in my book, but today's story focuses on the meaning that food takes on to moms trying to feed their kids. So before I dive into the inequalities that I uncovered in my research, I have to start with a commonality that bound all of the families that I met. And that commonality was that mothers across the income spectrum valued their children's diets and health. Most mothers I spoke with mentioned the importance of a healthy diet for their child, and they explicitly connected the dots between healthy eating and their kids' current and/or future health. So low-income mothers like Miranda Kirk, who told me, "You are what you eat. Food is your medicine. As a mom, you tell them as much as you possibly can throughout their life. Your health is going to depend on what you put into your body, period." Or higher income mothers like Alma Garcia, who told me, "I feel like food is an investment in our long-term overall health." And yet, despite these shared values, families reported diets of varying quality. While there was significant room for nutritional improvement in most families' diet quality, lower income families in my sample reported purchasing and consuming more highly processed, non-perishable products. So what explained these differences in consumption? So to answer this question, the first thing I did was I turned to the prevailing explanations in the field, in this case, the food access arguments, to see what leverage they might offer me in accounting for these differences across the families in my study. So to start, geographic access in my sample, a largely suburban sample, offered relatively little explanatory power. Using the USDA's food desert tracker, I could ascertain that most families did not reside in food deserts. In addition, while moms told me all kinds of challenges when it came to feeding their families, geographically accessing, like physically getting a hold of the food that they wanted, was not one of them. Financial access offered a far more promising explanation. To be sure, lower income families spent less money on food each month. Many received federal food assistance. A majority were food insecure, and low-income mothers reported being more price-oriented in their purchases. At the same time, though, mothers reported to me that they weren't always guided by price. In fact, moms like Faye Bautista reported spending more money on food than they otherwise would have in order to meet their children's requests. But I found out that it wasn't just low-income moms whose kids bombarded them with these types of requests for junk food. Across income, mothers faced pressure from kids to buy them less healthy foods. And this is far from surprising given the $1.8 billion in marketing that the food and beverage industry spends every single year to cultivate in children a desire for sugary drinks and cereals, salty snacks, and fast food. And yet I discovered that high, middle, and low income mothers in my sample navigated these pressures really differently. So through mothers' reports to me about how they responded to kids' requests, I generated a really simple count of how many mothers in each income group said that they regularly denied their kids' food requests for health reasons. While 96% of high-income mothers told me this, 54% and just 13% of low-income mothers said the same. Now, to be clear, it's not that low-income mothers never said no. It's just that when they did, they told me it was because they didn't have the money, not because of a health concern. Together, my analysis of mothers' reports and explanations paired with my own ethnographic observations generated a new finding about the dietary differences across families. And that finding was that moms' feeding practices stemmed in part from what food symbolically meant to them. And those symbolic meanings were fundamentally shaped by the socioeconomic context they were raising their children in. So in my book, I showcase these very different symbolic meanings through the stories of 4 mothers who I ethnographically observed for the research: Naya Baker, a Black low-income mom; Dana Williams, a white low-income mom; Renata Ortega, a middle-class Latina mom; and Julie Kane, a high-income white mother. Today, for time's sake, I'm going to focus on the symbolic meaning that food took on to low-income mothers and tell Naya's story. But I want to be clear that while I focus on this one story, Naya's experiences are not unique to her, but rather they reflect broader trends in my data about the symbolic meaning that food holds to lower-income mothers. So Naya was a single Black low-income mother of 2 daughters, Mariah and Natasha. And the November day that I met Naya, the 2 of us both found ourselves standing outside of a social servants agency at 6 o'clock in the morning, bundled up to brave the winter weather. Naya was there lined up with dozens of other parents to register for a Christmas toy drive so that she would have something to give Mariah and Natasha for the holidays. And I was there looking for families like Naya's to participate in my research. And when I told Naya about my study, she was instantly interested because I was compensating families $60 for participating in interviews. And for Naya, money was tight and it was always on her mind. And one thing that first struck me about Naya and that I came to admire about Naya was that she was not one to sugarcoat. She was extremely candid and took pride in telling it like it was. And Naya's honesty extended into how she talked about her family's diet, which Naya believed was not as healthy as it could be. She told me, "I think we're eating way unhealthy because of a lot of the snacks. Of course, I know that's junk food. I'm gonna keep it real. I buy a lot of junk food, snacks like donuts, Nutty Buddies, the popcorn and stuff like that, chips, sodas." Now, one reason that Naya bought these foods was that Mariah and Natasha asked for them all the time. Naya told me they always want potato chips, the cheesy kinds, cheese puffs or Cheetos. Like some things they do ask me, and I don't like to buy that stuff for them. I end up getting it. Then she paused for a second before adding, they win. They win all the time. But it wasn't only Naya's children who won. Other lower income moms echoed Naya in sharing that they too often obliged their kids' food requests. So moms like Margaret Nicholson, who told me about her kids, they're the ones who choose it. Whatever they like is what we eat. I really cater to what they like. So we do eat a lot of pizza, corn dogs, hot dogs, fish sticks, and tater tots, stuff like that. So how can we make sense of why moms like Margaret and Naya said yes to their kids, even when they knew full well that these foods were not healthy, and when they also truly valued their children's diets and health? Making sense of this requires understanding what it means to mother in a context of financial scarcity and insecurity, two hallmark features of raising a family in poverty in America today. The summer that I spent with Naya was one of the toughest summers she had ever experienced. A few months earlier, a series of health issues had left Naya unable to work. So in the meantime, Naya made ends meet by constructing a formal and an informal safety net for herself, including living off of the Social Security benefits that she received for her daughter's learning disabilities, as well as her boyfriend's SNAP benefits. And most of that money went fast. It went to rent, utilities, garbage, cell phone bills, and cable, and it left Naya with very little disposable cash. So that summer, without any money, there was very little to do. Naya once summed it up when she told me, "You need cash to do stuff." But Naya didn't have cash. So most of the time that I spent with her and her family that summer, we spent it sitting on the couch in her garage, watching TV and eating junk food. And Naya explained to me what she had told her daughters at the outset of summer, when she knew it was going to be a tough few months and that she wasn't going to have much to give them. She said, "I told them it's not all about fancy clothes and fancy cars. Be happy you have a roof over your head. You have food in here. You can watch TV when you want to and use the bathroom whenever you want to. You have a fan inside to go to when you get hot and a blanket to get under when you're cold." And then Naya added, "I'm just trying to survive." And in trying to survive, Naya had to say no to her kids all the time. She had to say no to the big things like vacation and summer camp. And she had to say no to the medium-sized things too, like a new pair of jeans or a replacement for a shattered phone screen. And as I watched Naya say no again and again and again and again to her daughter's requests, I realized something so simple, that in a world of no, food was actually something Naya could almost always say yes to. Naya could always find the buck at the bottom of her purse to buy her kids a can of soda or a bag of chips. There was almost always a sofa cushion that could be overturned to reveal a few coins that could help buy a candy bar. And so when Naya could say yes, she did say yes. Like later that afternoon, when we went to the supermarket, Natasha asked for this, Naya said yes. Or another afternoon when we drove by a Starbucks and Mariah wanted this, Naya said yes. And every single time the ice cream truck turned the corner towards Naya's house and that familiar jingle grew gradually louder in volume, Naya instinctively gave each of her kids a buck to go get whatever they wanted. You see, for moms like Naya who are living in poverty, financial scarcity yielded a scarcity of opportunities to provide for children. And that meant that there was a scarcity of opportunities for mom to communicate love to kids, to show them that they saw them, they heard them, and that they could not only give them what they needed, but also some of what they wanted. It also yielded a scarcity of opportunities for moms to feel like good and capable caregivers. One mom summed up the symbolic potency of food in this context when she told me about her daughters. "The way I feel about food is like, if they need food and they're hungry, then I'm gonna buy it. I don't care how much money's in my pocket. I'll spend my last $20. One day they'll know I love them and that's all that matters. If she wants a $2 candy bar, I get it for her if I have it." So deep was this desire to make kids happy amidst scarcity that both low-income mothers I observed, Naya and Dana, gave most of the compensation that they received for participating in the ethnography portion of the study directly to their children. Naya and Dana each received $300 in cash at the end of observations. And in both cases, they took $200 of that money and split it between their two daughters. Naya, for one, gave Mariah and Natasha each $100 and told them to spend it however they wanted, which they did. They went to the mall, they got fast food and candy, and they had what Naya told me was the best week of their entire summer. This is a woman who I once watched haggle with a cell phone agent to get $2 off her cell phone bill, and she took $200 and gave it to her daughters just to give them a few days of happiness. Then Naya paid off a bill, she put some gas in the car, and she said yes to herself with a bag of Doritos and an 18-pack of beer. Dana got a haircut, and she took her eldest daughter out to sushi. It's interesting to note, too, that neither Naya nor Dana considered spending the money, as some might think that they should or would have, to buy healthier food for their families. For these mothers, within the ongoing context of financial scarcity, the symbolic punch of being able to say yes to their children was worth far more than any healthy meal. So in contrast to how low-income mothers are often cast, I found that moms like Naya use food to be responsible caregivers, to show their kids that they love and they care for them, and to demonstrate their maternal worth to themselves and others. But food's symbolic meaning shapes how they go about accomplishing this goal. So for lower income moms like Naya and Dana, food can be a symbolic antidote in a context of financial scarcity. Moms can use food to buffer their kids against hardship and to compensate for other forms of deprivation. And in doing so, they can find daily evidence that they're good moms who can care and love and provide for their children. Understanding how families' context can shape what food means to them can help us also evaluate foods like this, not just from a public health standpoint, but also from a sociological one. Giving your kid a bag of Cheetos can be a genuine display of love and care when understood within a context of financial scarcity. So with this understanding of how food's meanings can help shape family food choices, where can we go from here? So to this question, and with my last minute, I'd like to propose 3 avenues forward among the many others that exist. So first, we can intervene with marketing food and drinks to children so that kids aren't inundated with ads for tasty, unhealthy treats on TV, billboards on their phones. And so maybe they'll stop asking their parents for these foods nonstop. This would actually give mothers a fighting chance of being able to feed kids what they want, rather than what corporations push on them. Second, we can fund and support schools to become hubs of nutritional nourishment and education, not only by reducing kids' exposure to junk food and by banning marketing within school walls, but also through offering nutritious and appealing meals to kids across society so that we can help cultivate in children a taste and a preference for healthier foods that they can bring back into their families. Ultimately, though, the solutions that we need are ones that can actually help shift food's meanings for lower income families in America. Of course, we need to ensure that families have adequate access to healthy food, but we just as badly need sweeping structural reforms that strengthen the safety net for struggling families and help improve families' material conditions. If we can enact policies that effectively and enduringly lift families out of poverty, then we can also shift the meaning of food. We can make it so that a bag of Cheetos is just a bag of Cheetos, rather than a potent symbol of love and care amidst a backdrop of scarcity. So thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to the panelists' comments and questions into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fielding-Singh. I do think this is one of the most important books written on food and social policy literally in decades. As you know me, I keep such praise really sparing, and I mean it. And why is Hunger Free America promoting this? Because we, along with many on our, all the people on this panel, we are really trying to bridge the gap between the public health communities and the hunger communities, and say it is ridiculous that there has been a gap sometimes, and that we need to come together to find real life solutions that really work. And, I'm a somewhat ideological fellow, but first and foremost, data counts, reality counts. And some on the right say the only problem with poverty is behavior. And some on the left say the only problem is capitalism or racist oppression, all of which are real issues, and don't understand the nuances of the connections between the inequality of wealth, the structural racism, and how that impacts behavior. And in the end, unless we're able to help real people in the real world with real solutions, what we're doing doesn't matter. And I think your work helps point to that. And lastly, before I introduce Secretary Glickman, I do have to make one note about public policy. Of course, we at Hunger Free America agree with you 1,000% that school meals should universally be funded, should be free and healthy, with local foods wherever possible, and sustainably grown foods wherever possible. And I know Tufts has done some great work showing that school meals are often the healthiest meals kids get each day. But right now, I'm not being partisan, this is just a factual statement. Senate Republicans are standing in the way of extending some of the pandemic era extensions of universal school meals. So if they get their way and these are ended, some of these problems could get even worse. So thank you so much, Doctor. With that, it is my true honor to introduce former Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman. You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. The most common words in the English language today are "you're on mute." So I just showed how common I was. But Joel, thank you. Thanks to Hunger Free America, where I'm privileged now to serve on your board, and I appreciate it very much. And Priya, if I may call you that, this is an amazing book. Why? Because we get bogged down in the statistics, and those statistics are very important, but the human anecdotes really demonstrate the complexity of the issues. And Shakespeare said once, "The play is the thing." And what you gave us is the play today, the narrative. It's more than the numbers in a kind of a macro, totally objective fashion where we can't dig into them and figure out what's in people's minds and what's in their hearts. And so I really do appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that these are difficult issues and they're complicated issues. And I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said, "For every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution." And the problem with this is such a complicated area, as you point out, that there's no real one solution to these. And you dealt with four. I read your anecdotes of your 4 things, and I just thought, gee, you know what? I'm more in the upper income category, yet I fall prey to a lot of the same things myself, in terms of what I give my kids and my grandkids and everything else, what they see on TV, how much is marketed and how much is advertised and how that impacts their lives. And some of it is not just love. It's just, okay, here it is. Stay away from me. Let me do my work. But I understand exactly what you're talking about. The one thing I would say is that, and Dr. Mozaffarian is on, who can talk more about this. After the COVID era, I see how public health has heretofore not been an important part of our view of health. And after COVID, we now see how important public health is and how we've underestimated the power of education and the power of the health community, the medical community, in dealing with these issues. And heretofore, medicine is not necessarily seen food as a critical part of what we're required to do. And now they do that work at Tufts and other places. And food, medicine, nutrition, health, they're all part of one big pile of solutions that need to be considered. And I hope you'll talk to some degree about the power of medicine and the power of the health community, the power of doctors, nurses, healthcare providers, and trying their best to not only in treatment and in prevention, but in education, to help people get through some of the quandaries that they exist in. So anyway, I just thank you. At USDA, we've done a lot over the years, the dietary guidelines, the food guide pyramid, My Plate. It hasn't been perfect. There have been improvements in school meals, however, over the last dozen years or so. We have a long way to go on the importance of school meals. And as Joel pointed out, the importance of that, particularly in this post-COVID era we're in. So I just wanted to compliment you on this book. I would, at some point, love to hear your views on the whole issue of our SNAP program and the power of sugar sweetened beverages in people's lives and the power of marketing of these foods, and whether we ought to consider some restrictions in that area. I won't bog you down with details about that right now, but I suspect that's an issue that the public health community is going to continue to look at in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Glickman. Before I introduce Ms. Cousin, Dr. Fielding-Singh, do you want a brief response to that question specifically about sugar-flavored beverages?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for those really kind words and reflections on both the presentation and the book. And I just agree with so many other things that you brought up. And in this talk, I felt like I had to speak to kind of a narrow stream within the book, but the role of marketing and marketing both to children, I talk about a little bit in this talk, but in the book, I really dig into marketing to parents as well. And, you know, the food and beverage industry creating sort of problems that then they poise themselves to solve, like kids pickiness, this idea that kids should be eating different foods than parents, this notion that foods are a way to satisfy your kid and to get them, to your point, to leave you alone at times. So I just think that there is such pernicious and sneaky marketing tactics that I think any movement in the right direction toward regulating marketing to children in particular would be extremely powerful and would just level the playing field in the sense of, you know, we have this narrative in our society that parents and mothers in particular are responsible for what children are eating, and we need to encourage them to make healthier choices. But we don't talk about the fact that the deck is completely stacked against that when everything that children see, everything that they have easy access to is, you know, unhealthy, highly processed, very cheap foods. And so I think in order to actually give families more choice, that involves regulating the industry in ways that create choice rather than kind of this illusion of choice with actually just this inundation of unhealthy foods. So I'll limit my comments to that, but I have obviously a lot more to say, and I hope we can continue that conversation.
And short answers we previously discussed, you would be more in favor of regulating industry than regulating what low-income people can buy, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I think about it more from an industry level. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Cousins, some reaction.
Well, first of all, Joe, let me thank you for convening this important conversation about this very good book that, in fact, when I saw your announcement about this panel, I said, I've already read the book and was quite impressed with the ability to humanize the challenges that are facing families across America as they work to feed their children, and in all of these various scenarios that you so well describe in your book. Let me take a step back and embrace a concept that permeates your book and your conversation this morning. And that is a recognition that food is love, it is culture, it is, as you say, symbolic, and how that symbolism is reflected in behavior by parents and how the decisions they make or the decisions they allow their children to make about food is so often limited by their inability to say yes to most things. And having grown up in Lawndale on Chicago's west side and knowing that sound of the ice cream truck as it comes around the corner on a hot July afternoon, and every child in the neighborhood running into the house, and this shows how old I am, because then it was to get a quarter in order to purchase something off that truck, and every parent not wanting to be the one who didn't give their child that quarter, whose child couldn't run to that truck because they didn't have even that quarter, and today that dollar, to provide that joy to when every other child was experiencing that opportunity. Is many mothers would have said, I'm failing. And we, because we define, we whether it's societal or community or simply our own personal the challenges and thoughts that we drive in how we parent. We want our children to be happy. And so often what food does, as your book so well documents from your observations and conversations, is that happiness is just giving them what they want. And what I would argue, though, and you allude to this in your book, is that giving them what they want that makes them happy is not driven solely by income, because you saw it with high income moms as well. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, I will tell the story of my sister very quickly, who was a high-level executive, and her husband was a stay-at-home dad. And she came home one day to the realization that her husband was feeding her children Pop-Tarts for breakfast. And she said, I'm a failure as a mother. And it's just unbelievable. I never thought I would be the kind of mother whose children would eat Pop-Tarts for breakfast. And I said, but he's also giving them eggs and milk and preparing them for school. And so that guilt doesn't have, we as mothers across this country, we all, if you interview any mother, they will tell you their guilt stories about what their children eat, because they are every day trying to balance everything else in their lives and all those other decisions, whether it's a low-income mom trying to get the car fixed, or a high-income mom trying to figure out how to get back home in time for dinner that night after meetings all day. And so you balance those decisions, whether they are high-class problems, as we like to call them, or the problems of people trying to make it on so little. And food gives you the ability to let's just keep them happy. Let's just keep them happy. But let me just finish with one important issue that I think you touched on, and that's school meals and the importance of school meals and healthier food available to all children in school. It's so interesting that we see schools as a place of education, but we don't see lunchtime as part of that education. And it is so we have an opportunity through not just providing healthier meals that are good food that kids will enjoy, but also about expanding children's knowledge about their food that they eat and why they eat different foods as a part of that lunchtime experience. That will begin to change what food symbolizes to those children, ultimately to those families, and to our societies as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cousins. I must note, while I will not vouch for the nutritional value, which is probably a negative net 10,000, Pop-Tarts can taste pretty well. I know it's a ghastly combination, but the chocolate and vanilla cream, can be delicious. And I think we can't take the notion of food as pleasure out of this. And there is this class bias notion, that yuppies will have a 1,500 calorie artisanal pork belly dish and then lecture low-income people that they're evil for, wanting to have something pleasurable. And sometimes, nutritionists talk about it like, food is just this nutrition delivery pellet, like via the Jetsons. And we have to figure out this in the full content, and to make healthier food more pleasurable and more, and convenient. And with that, it's a great transition. My friend, Dean Mozaffarian, your reaction.
Well, first I will say Pop-Tarts taste terrible, and that we have diseased palates that are eating food that we have not been evolved to eat, and healthy food tastes and is far more pleasurable. But most people don't understand. Healthy food is not a fat-free concoction made by a company put in a package. A healthy food is a dish that takes time and effort and lots of work to make that most people don't have time to do. And so Pop-Tarts actually taste terrible, just like Cheetos. So I don't think they taste good at all. We've just been sort of fooled into thinking they taste good. I do think that my own personal bias, obviously. So I think this has just been a wonderful discussion, and I really agree with everything that I've heard so far. I will say I am a parent of 3 kids, 9, 11, and 13, age 9, 11, and 13 years. And my wife and I actually use this phrase together. It feels good to say yes. We say that. We say no a lot. And when we say yes, we're like, God, it feels so good to say yes. Can you drive me to school today? Can I go out? Can I go for a sleepover? Can I do this? Can I do that? We have a world of options given our incomes and social class and white privilege of things we can say yes to that most people don't. And so I really get in a visceral way this wanting to say yes and how it feels good. So I think that's a wonderful highlight from the presentation, and I really congratulate Dr. Fielding-Singh for that. I also think that the thesis of the book is beyond that, and I think this is intended, that it's that the simplistic explanations that we've sort of hung our hats on to fix food and to fix the problem are incorrect. And I would just raise 3 that we've written about are simplistic explanations. One is the whole notion of food deserts, which has just captured the imagination. The geographic proximity and density to restaurants and foods and grocery stores is not a causal driver of poor nutrition, and we have to stop focusing on that. Number 2, lack of knowledge is not a major driver of this, and Dr. Fielding-Singh highlighted that. And number 3, we didn't talk about this, but the farm subsidies are not a major driver of the food that we eat. Another very simplistic sort of quick Band-Aid fix. So we have to move beyond that and really think about what's actually the complex web of things that are influencing food and nutrition and health. The other thing I'll say is that, just the opening of Dr. Fielding-Singh's thesis, we shouldn't forget, most Americans are extremely sick from food. Less than 1 in 10 Americans are metabolically healthy. Less than 1 in 10. And this spans all social classes, all income groups, all educations, all races and ethnicities. And so while there are disparities, meaning worse circumstances for rural, lower educated, lower income, and racial and ethnic minorities, this is true across all groups. And so the solutions we identify, the problems we identify are not limited to any group. We have a systems problem. When you have 1 in 4 teenagers who have prediabetes, 1 in 4 teenagers who have overweight or obesity, 1 in 6 teenagers who have fatty liver disease, we have a systems problem. This isn't a problem of individual choice and individual families. So I think that's a key point that Dr. Fielding-Singh started with. I also want to highlight that I think this is a good time to talk about the concept of nutrition security, because I think that food insecurity, which has had many successes, has led to this notion of access and price. And I think nutrition security, which affects many more Americans than nutrition insecurity, which affects many more Americans than food insecurity, has multiple influences and multiple solutions. So I think we need to shift to that concept for thinking of solutions. So we've done a lot of work at Tufts thinking about what is the science and evidence behind solutions. And I would say we sort of 3 big buckets. We need policy change, we need innovation in the private sector, and we need culture change. And all 3 of those can be helpful: policy change, innovation, and culture change. I think among the 3 things that Dr. Fielding-Singh mentioned, marketing, schools, and the safety net, I just have brief comments. Marketing restrictions, we have the major challenge of the First Amendment in the United States that no other country has. And just legally, we've had legal scholars who've worked with this analysis. It would not pass the First Amendment to have marketing restrictions for children for probably anything, maybe up to age 5, we could say we could do this. So if we wanted to do marketing restrictions, we might be able to do them up to age 5, but beyond age 5, it wouldn't likely pass the First Amendment. And so I just think that as a public health and policy and anti-hunger community, we shouldn't put too much effort in that for older kids, because in the US, we're just stuck with the First Amendment. I think second, for schools, schools are 9% of calories on average across the year for kids in the United States. 91% calories come from other sources. The biggest source by far is foods purchased by their families in the grocery stores. That's about 2/3 of calories. And that 9% of calories is the same, roughly the same by race, by income, by education. So the statistic that you hear that 50% of calories come from schools, like that's just not true. Maybe there's certain kids on certain days, but on average, it's 9% of calories. So, and schools are actually pretty good right now. They're pretty good. We can strengthen them, but I don't think we should be putting all our effort into schools as the major thing. We have to fix everything outside schools more. Schools are pretty good, and I agree with Ambassador Cousin, and I agree with Dr. Fielding-Singh about things we can do, and Joel about things we can do to further strengthen schools. But I just really want to emphasize, whatever we do in schools, it won't greatly influence the other 91% of calories. And so I think, the 6 domains of action that I think we need to take to help shift the needle. I think we need to leverage healthcare, and Secretary Glickman mentioned this. We have to leverage healthcare dollars to pay for healthy food for all Americans who need it. There's no reason we're spending, I'm a cardiologist, we're spending thousands and thousands of dollars on drugs and devices and surgeries and procedures. We should be spending money on food, healthy food for everyone, particularly people with certain disease conditions. Second, we have to leverage the federal nutrition programs. And I agree with Secretary Glickman that school meals and WIC are pretty good. We need to strengthen them, expand access, universal school meals, many things we can do, but they're already pretty good. We really need to focus on SNAP. We need to make sure that SNAP is being leveraged for nutrition security. And there's lots of ways to do it that could include restrictions or could not include restrictions. There's incentives and disincentives, but SNAP right now is not a nutrition program. It's an access program. We have to shift SNAP to really be a supplemental nutrition assistance program. Third, we have to utilize education and communication. And I think that, FDA, power of the FDA, it's woefully underfunded for food. The dietary guidelines are underfunded for influence. But beyond the government, thinking specifically about Dr. Fielding-Singh's research, we have to focus on really getting influencers, influencers in culture, influences in social media, sports stars, musicians, to really be out there. And you're starting to see this with folks like Steph Curry and Tom Brady and Russell Wilson starting to talk about healthy food and healthy eating. But the more we can get the culture shift around, people that really influence kids, especially, that'll have much more powerful effects, I think, than what we can do through the government can do. The fourth bucket, we need to advance science and research. There's a lot of stuff we don't understand about the basic science of nutrition and health, nutrition and microbiome, translational research, behavior change, research like Dr. Fielding-Singh. I don't know how your research was funded. I'm guessing it wasn't a $2 million NIH grant. It should have been a $2 million NIH grant. You probably funded this on the your back of shoestrings and other things, because research like this often isn't well funded. So we have to expand our science research funding. Fifth, we have to actually reward business innovation. So I think, Priya, I agree with you. We have to target the business, but I think we'll be much more successful politically and practically if we focus on reward for companies that are doing the right thing rather than trying to penalize companies that are doing the wrong thing. We will hit all kinds of barriers if we only penalize. I think we should do both, carrots and sticks. We should have rewards for using environmental social governance investing structures. We should have tax policy, opportunity zones, many things the government can organize to reward business innovation. Food systems for the future, which Ambassador Cousin leads, is thinking about this deeply. So I think we need to reward business innovation. And then lastly, we need to coordinate federal food policy. We have over 200 investments and hundreds of billions of dollars in food healthcare being spent at the federal level trying to improve nutrition, and it's not coordinated. And the US Government Accountability Office made that conclusion. And so we need a White House office on food and nutrition that can coordinate this. And so those are my comments. And I think that as Ambassador Cousin, Secretary Glickman, Joel Berg, and I have all called for a White House conference on food, nutrition, hunger, and health could help us actually start to put all these things together. And I hope that Dr. Fielding-Singh would be a keynote speaker at such a conference.
Great. And I'll introduce Dr. Fielding-Singh for a second for a response before if you guys can stay for a few more minutes, other questions from the public. I do mention, her book points out there's no one cause for this. There's no one set of reactions to this. Every household is different. But I must point out, as an anti-hunger advocate, there are 35 million Americans living in homes that can't always afford enough food. It is more common for people to buy less healthy, cheaper food, but there are people who significantly reduce their food intake whatsoever. We run the National Hunger Hotline on behalf of USDA, and a few weeks ago, someone called who hadn't eaten in 8 weeks and was very weak. 8 days. And was very weak. And we actually had to call for an ambulance to take them to the emergency room for them to get nourished. So this is a very complex issue. Dr. Fielding-Singh, do you want a brief response to the other panelists before we open up for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much for those really thoughtful responses and reflections and ideas for how we move forward. I want to respond first to Ambassador Cousin and just, I'm really grateful that you brought up this really gendered component of nutrition and hunger and food and food inequality. I think that feeding children is so core to what it means to be a good mother in this country. And that story has often gotten lost in how we talk about how parents feed their kids and inequalities in those behaviors. I write at the end of my book that, I spoke with families living far below the poverty line to those living well above it. And I expected to find one mother who didn't feel guilty about the food that her kids were eating. And I couldn't find her because that is how widespread both the responsibility is that mothers feel and the guilt that they experience for feeling like they're falling short of that all the time. And so, Dr. Mozaffarian, I really understand and take your point about school meals and the potential of that to improve nutrition. I also think about school meals as important, though, and universal school meals from a gender equity perspective of taking some of the responsibility that has been placed solely on, or at least primarily on mothers' shoulders and shifting it onto institutions that should also be taking a collective responsibility for how children in our country are eating. So I agree with you on the limitations from a nutritional perspective, but I also think from a hunger perspective and from a gender perspective, there are other gains to be made from advancing a school meal agenda. I also, Dr. Mozaffarian, really appreciate your point about the limitations of the food access argument. And I've been really struck during my conversations and presentation of this book about how strongly so many people, or like how that still is the prevailing narrative in the public discourse about what the problem is. And my one hope for this book was that if you take anything away from it, it's that we need to be moving the conversation far beyond food access. As important as it is, it's obviously not the causal driver, and it's also not the solution to our problems. And I really appreciate the 6 buckets that you spoke about, and just fully embrace this idea of we need to be thinking on a systemic level about something that we have been talking about on an individual basis forever. And we also need to be framing food and access to healthy food as a human right. And I think if we do that, then so many of the suggestions that have been laid out today follow from that, but we don't tend to think about it that way. And so alongside those changes, just, I hope that we can, in advancing some of the agenda items that you've listed, also reframe it in a way to where we think about healthy food as something that everyone is entitled to, rather than something that a privileged echelon of society should have access to. So thank you all so much for those thoughts.
Here, here. Thank you so much. So we originally billed this as an hour, but this conversation's been so robust. If any of you have a chance to stay on and take on some questions from the viewers, great. If you have to pop off, we fully understand. Emilio, do you have any questions for us from the viewers?
Yeah, so there was hi everybody, my name is Emilio Tavares. I'm the policy director for Hunger Free America. And one of the questions that came in was, do you think and I guess this is for everybody, do you think something like the infusion of cash via the child tax credit and other pandemic relief measures would be enough to change the context of food for families like the ones you work with? So I guess that's actually more for you, Priya.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think what we know from the child tax credit is that it was remarkably effective at addressing hunger in particular. Now, and I think in doing so, also helping to shift the meaning of food in some ways. I think the challenges there are that one, it was temporary, and often dietary changes tend to occur when there's like a kind of sustained change over time. So parents know that they can count on that money moving forward. But then, you know, if we separate, we're talking about nutrition on the one hand and hunger on the other hand. I think it's extremely effective for hunger. I think to actually improve families' nutrition, it's probably a starting point. In the sense that I think we need really sweeping structural reforms that like consistently and significantly improve families' material conditions. And one reason, as I talk about in the book, is that this is, you know, feeding kids well is a difficult endeavor for any family. High income families, you know, face some challenges as well. And so, you know, for lower income families, these types of cash infusions, I think, were effective, but the fact that they expired at the end of last year and the fact that families also knew that they wouldn't be receiving them probably meant that from a nutritional standpoint, they didn't make a significant dent. That said, we will have data, diet quality data from 2021 from N. Haynes coming out hopefully sometime this year. So that's actually an empirical question that we can see what impact that had on adults and children's nutrition.
And bottom line is, when low-income people have more money, they have more money to say yes to other things other than food and have more ability to buy, you know, healthier food. And one of the things when you talk about the immediate payout, people have studied, you know, lottery winners in low-income neighborhoods, is if they knew they were going to get that extra $300 or $200 a month, there's a likelihood different behavior than if it was a one-time windfall they never thought they were going to get again. And a lot of people have stated that. Other questions?
There were no other questions, and I know that you know, we are over time at this point. So I think maybe a good way to end would be, what do you recommend viewers do after this, besides reading the book, in terms of taking action to support this cause?
Well, of course, they should support Hunger Free America. But also, I mean, I lay out in the book, you know, obviously these kind of broader changes that we can take on a policy level in the private and public sectors. But I think that one small thing that each of us can do is think critically about how we discuss food inequalities and how we talk about things like individual choice and willpower and responsibility when it comes to feeding families. And one thing that I think has been really clear from this discussion is that all of us are in favor of thinking about the structural forces and the systemic inequalities that trickle down into individual behaviors, and to contextualizing those behaviors in ways that are more compassionate and less judgmental. And so that is one reason that I wrote the book and wanted to have a space to tell these stories in a nuanced and complex way, to be able to encourage a more compassionate conversation. And I think that's something that all of us can do in the conversations that we have in our daily lives and the ways that we talk about these issues with our friends and family. And so that's one small thing that as individuals we can do moving forward.
I would just add that I just placed in the chat our comprehensive policy recommendations we sent to the House Rules Committee last year. We strongly support a White House conference on food, hunger, and nutrition. Again, we don't think it should focus on one or the other. We think nutritional insecurity and food insecurity are very significant issues that need to be dealt with. So we would ask you to weigh in with your senators, your congresspeople on behalf of this, particularly to pass some version of the Build Back Better bill, which would not only increase hunger funding, but make childcare more affordable, which I'm sure is a huge burden, on low-income families, to give more cash to low-income people, to really pressure, particularly if you live in a state with a Senate Republican, to get McConnell off his opposition to expanding and extending school meals. So those are immediate things. push for increases in the minimum wage. In your state, the minimum wage hasn't increased nationwide in a few decades. Some states in the South are even below the federal minimum wage of $7.25, an hour. And I just close by saying this is not inevitable. This is not unsolvable. We almost ended hunger entirely in the 1970s because we had higher wages and a more inclusive, economy. Other nations on the planet have ended hunger and ensured nutrition, security for their folks. And if I leave anything with you, do not think this is hopeless and there's nothing individuals can do. So I just want to thank everyone for this discussion. Thank you, Dr. Fielding-Singh. If you can contact me at Hunger Free America, J. Berg at hungerfreeamerica.org. And if you want to have an event promoting, the book or a book club, read it, we can, pass it on and see if we can get some more feedback from Dr. Fielding-Singh or the publisher. We really want to get the word out about this, and not just because it's a book, because the message is so important. And thank you all for your time. We're also going to share a video of this, which we hope everyone can share widely. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Joel, for hosting this in A Hunger Free America, and thanks everyone for coming.